So now that we have an 1890s skirt, we need to take a quick moment to focus on another very important matter. That is the bustle pad. A small and seemingly insubstantial thing, but vital in holding out the back of the skirt ever so slightly, allowing the pleats to sit neatly, the waistband to be level, and just overall achieving that proper late Victorian silhouette. I decided to do a particular bit of experimentation with this project. Rather than finding an actual pattern or just finding some sort of pillow situation to just stuff back there, I dug up an actual patent submitted for an actual bustle pad. There are a number of these running rampant on Pinterest, but do not be fooled, for these are only the tip of the iceberg. A visit to the archives of the US Patent website provides a wealth of additional information in the form of the all-important text that accompanies these pretty drawings. So this is what I decided to use for my primary research and reference for this project. It should be emphasized that this is not a pattern. There aren't instructions or measurements included here, so there was a fair bit of deduction and interpretation happening on my end. But what would a Lady Sherlock project be without a bit of brain work? Okay, so this is the pattern that I'm going to be working with for this project. It's actually not a pattern. It's not a pattern at all. It's a patent. There are actually quite a few of these on the US Patent Office archive. They're all free. They're all available as PDFs online. Basically, on October the 13th, 1903, someone called H.H. Taylor submitted this patent for a bustle pad, and not only shows these little diagrams of how they're supposed to work, but also gives quite detailed instructions on the materials and vaguely how they go together. Just some notes on the construction for this. It's not a pattern, so it doesn't give dimensions, it doesn't give points, it doesn't give measurements at all. It's probably something that I'm going to have to experiment with a little bit before I actually go ahead and make the real thing, just to figure out the scale of this. He goes through and gives lots of really nice instructions on, for example, what it's made out of. So he specifically states that this should not be made out of a woven material because somehow this is meant to stretch and conform to the shape of the wearer, and that's the whole sort of central idea to this patent. So it needs to be made out of a non-woven material, which he advises sheet cotton wadding, which I think there is the entire possibility that sheet cotton wadding in the 19th century or early 20th century was different from what I have in my head as sheet cotton wadding, but I think it is essentially the sort of flat sheet cotton wadding that I used for padding in the corset. So I already have that in my possession, but he also says that any material that is not woven will work, for example, soft felt. So that's also a possibility. Basically, according to these details, this thing is made out of 2 layers of sheet cotton wadding, which are the outside layers, and then it's sort of stuffed with loose cotton. As you can see, there's not very much stuffing in this. As I've been playing around with padding throughout this process, I'm actually coming to realize that you don't need as much padding as you think you need to have a significant effect on these clothes. So I think this thing is actually quite subtle. So I shall be playing around with amount of stuffing and widths and all that shaping sort of thing during this process, which should be really exciting. This is also connected to a waistband at the waist. I laughed a little bit because he just sort of glosses over this and says the waistband at the top is finished in the usual manner. Okay, we don't live in 1903 anymore, so we don't exactly know what the usual manner is, but you know, it's something we can figure out. It's something that we can look at other sources to figure out. Based on waistbands of skirts that I've been looking at, I think this is just sort of a slim bit of ribbon that's just been stitched, obviously running stitched here, and then probably fell down onto the other side. I'm not sure entirely how cotton wadding stitches. I'm not actually sure that felling will work on cotton wadding, but we shall see. This is something that we shall find out. And then, of course, there's this carefully thought out, patented little detail of the stitching lines that are supposed to just keep everything snugly together. And apparently this is done very deliberately in that they are sort of concentric and radial like this. And these are 3 different possibilities of stitching that all apparently work, but doing them in any other way will apparently impede the stretch, the natural stretch of this bustle pad thing, and will prevent it from properly conforming to the wearer. So interesting. It's something I never thought about. But of course we shall be going ahead and we shall be following Mr. Taylor's instructions, and we shall be doing some sort of pattern here. I think I may go for the top one. I got sort of the implication based on reading these instructions that this was the one that he came up with first, and then did these other 2 as sort of alternatives. These 2 are sort of adaptations of this, I should say, and that this one's just the concentric lines, this one's just the radial lines. But I think I'm going to try and maybe go for both. We'll see. So yes, this seems fairly straightforward. Now the next sort of question is, what scale is this? How do we even get this into real life? How big should it be? All that fun stuff. So let's go ahead and start experimenting with some drafting. Okay, so we have no measurements for this beast. We have no clue where to even start. So I have a cunning plan in that I think if I can at least get this curve here, I think I can pretty much figure out the rest of it just based on proportion. I have measured sort of across back side seam to side seam accommodating for this curve on myself. It's about 14.5 inches, so I think that's what I'm trying to go for, roughly. This is the pattern that I drafted for the walking skirt. This is the center front. And he had us draft a little curve at the waistband because, you know, waistbands are curved, as we have discovered. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm just going to translate this curve here. So that's the beginning of our curve, hypothetically. This is not 14 inches. This is 6 1/4, so we just need to extend it up 1 inch. Okay, so this is now precisely 7 1/4, which should be exactly what we want. Okay, so to find out how long this is, I did some cross multiplying, which I never thought I'd have to do beyond high school, but if I did this correctly, then I think it's going to be 5.11 inches. So like basically 5. I'm so proud. Look what I did. Okay, so if this was 4 1/4 inches on the paper, but if that's actually 14.5 inches on me, and if this is 1.5, then what is that on me? So I did the cross multiplying thing and I came up with 5.11. If this doesn't work, then I will not be surprised, but if this does work, I will be so thrilled. This is going to be 5 inches down, and then I think we can go ahead and just figure out our curve from there. Okay, so I have decided to also put in this X line here, which I have figured out is exactly 1 inch down, which seems suspiciously like a solid decision, which means hopefully I'm doing something right. So we've got this X line here at 1 inch down. Oh my goodness, then I think I can find out what this point is, and then I think I can also find out what this distance is, which means I'm most of the way there. Oh my goodness, math is so thrilling. If only they actually taught us like pattern drafting math in school, maybe I'd actually like it. But chances are this is all wrong, so I'm going to be very disheartened when I find out that I actually do indeed still hate math, but it's fine. Okay, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because I can't find these measurements because I don't know what those are in real life. So I can't have that other thing to X. Oh my god, I'm so sorry, people who actually math. Okay, so what I have done is, because this is 1 3/4 inches, this is 1.5 inches, and I know this is 5 inches. The 1.5 inches is 5 inches, so I figured out what 1/4 of an inch would be, and that would be 0.8. So in theory, all I have to do is add this 0.8, which is the 1/4 inch, the additional 1/4 inch on the 3/4, to the 1.5 inch measurement, and in theory, that should be 5 and... wait, but I don't actually know what 0.8 is in fractions. Wait, Google. This is very historically accurate. 4/5. But what does that translate to in inches? Okay, well basically it's a little bit more than 3/4 of an inch. So something between 3/4 and 7/8. So 5 and more than 3/4. Oh, but look at that. These two here are also 1.5, which means that these 2 points are also at 5 inches from this point here. Looks like the top of the waistband here is the center point. Okay, so I think this is where I am so far, if I can just move you so that maybe you can vaguely see this. I am maybe a little bit doubting that my curve is quite dramatic enough, but we shall see, because, I mean, obviously this is a front curve and this is a back curve, and I think the back might be a little bit steeper than the front. This is something to go on. We shall see what happens. I think what I may do is I may just cut out one sample bit of wadding out of this and just lay it on a dress form or something just to see if this curve is quite correct. I will add more if I need more, and I will not add more if I don't need more. Let's go ahead and cut this out so that we can proceed on to seeing if this works.
Before I jump into starting the real thing, I'm first just cutting out a little sample shape to use as a sort of mock-up. The main thing I want to check is the curve at the waist, so I'm pinning it to my dress form and I'm just scooping out the top edge where it crosses over the waist tape. That's looking a little bit better, so now we're ready to proceed on to the real thing. And in other news, that was probably the easiest mock-up I have ever attempted. I'm just quickly making this little adjustment on the pattern so that I can go ahead and cut out a top and bottom piece from the real sheet cotton in the correct shape. I did decide to add on an extra 3/8 or so at the bottom just by eye to compensate for the bit that I cut off the top. I also had to do the very gross thing of marking out the pieces in ink, since chalk and pencil weren't really an option here. This won't be seen from the right side, but it still wanted to squidge onto my fingers with the lightest brush, which was annoying, but I suppose it did the job. I can then get started assembling this thing by pinning both pieces with right sides together and stitching along this line. The shape stitched and turned, it's time to add in the stuffing. As I mentioned previously, I'm using some loose cotton stuffing. About a handful's worth is what I think I ended up putting into this. I did try and put a little bit more than I thought would be appropriate into the pad, since there's a fair bit of quilting that gets stitched in, and so it will all become quite compact in the end, I think. Retrospective Bernadette popping in here for a second, just to state that I don't think that I put quite enough stuffing in, so put a little bit more than what I'm doing here. Whilst I'm doing this, I'm also trying to ensure that the stuffing is distributed evenly throughout and all the way up to the edges so that none of the quilted sections will appear over or understuffed on the finished piece. I'm just basting this top edge shut now with a long running stitch, and once again just ensuring that the stuffing is nice and uniformly distributed. I can then mark out the lines for the quilting, which I'm doing by folding at the lines I drew on my pattern and then thread marking into place. Because as we have discovered, you can't really mark this fabric, and I don't think I fancy putting ink onto the outside. Yes, this was acceptable in earlier periods to mark out boning channels and embroidery patterns and such in ink, but I feel like this sort of goes against that quintessential Victorian sense of perfectionism. I mean, they couldn't bear the sight of knots in clothing, so I feel like visible inked lines would be a particular offense to the eye, no? Anyway. This done, I'm taking it to the machine to stitch over these marked lines. And then, because this machine doesn't backstitch, I'm just securing the bottom ends of the thread by re-threading them through the needle, tucking them inside the pad, then clipping off the ends to stop them from going anywhere. The ones at the waistband edge are fine as they are. Those will be properly secured when the waistband goes on in a bit. I'm also now going ahead and putting in that outermost row of concentric stitching. Since it's so close to the edge, I can just use the edge of the machine foot to gauge its distance and won't have to worry about measuring and marking this one out. So now that that's done, I'm now just marking up 1 inch from that first row of stitching to find the middle row, thread marking that curve, then pinning and marking the highest row at 1.5 inches above the last. Once again, these lines are stitched over on the machine to complete the quilting pattern. Okay, here is where we are so far. We've got all of the stitching down. This is looking quite like a thing. As you can see, it is very, very slim indeed. I'm wondering if I should have put a bit more in this or if this is correct. Obviously, I will have to wait and try this on with the skirt. As you can see, once again, the cross-section diagram here does look very, very slim. So I think I'm headed in the right direction, although we shall see. All I have left to do is just to put the waistband on this in the usual manner, according to our friend Mr. H.H. Taylor. As far as I am aware, the usual manner is, it's just that the waistbands on a lot of Victorian skirts, late Victorian skirts, tended to be done very small, very slim, and out of ribbon or just a piece of the fabric itself. Since obviously this isn't really fabric, I think I'm going to use just a bit of ribbon. I happen to have quite a substantial amount of this grosgrain left over from the deerstalker hat, so I think I will go ahead and use this ribbon for the waistband tape edge thing, and I think how I'm going to stitch it on, I may trim this down just a little bit, just in case that raw edge there, and then I will go in and do a little hand back stitch, probably stab stitched through to both sides, because I don't feel like a felling stitch would really hold in this, just because it is, I mean, it's not a woven fabric, it is just essentially felted, I guess, just cotton fibers, and I feel like felling stitches eventually would just want to pull out. So I'm going to stab stitch all the way through, fully encase both layers of cotton as well as both edges of the ribbon. That is my plan of battle. Although first I just have to remove some of this basting in here from these concentric circles that still have basting in them. So I'm off to go do that. Then I shall go put the waistband on and we'll finish this thing. Also, wait, can we talk about the fact that I think every article of clothing in this Lady Sherlock project has some sort of cheeky element of this dark red working its way into this, including the bustle pad, which I most certainly didn't think would conform to that, but you know what? Themes, I guess. I'm trimming the edge of the seam allowance here down to about 1/4 inch so that my 1/2 inch ribbon will fold neatly over it. Then, in the interest of being purely redundant, I'm once again attaching this with a back stitch in matching cotton thread. And finally, the edges of the ribbon are finished with a quick bit of turning and felling.
All right, my friend, we now have a little bustle pad. She's all complete, she's all ready to go. This was a wonderful and wonderfully simple and not very time-consuming project, so highly recommend if you are doing some late 19th century or early 20th century work, highly recommend following. At least this patent was quite simple. I can't speak for the other ones. There are also quite a few on the Patent Archive website, so perhaps next time I shall give one of those a try, but for now, can highly attest that this was quite manageable, quite simple, did it in about a day, so yeah. Go for it. Thank you once again for coming along on this journey with me, these Lady Sherlock adventures, however small and unseen this particular project may be. However, I shall be back quite soon with some new installments in the Lady Sherlock series, so I hope you will stay tuned for that, and I shall see you next time.